I've spent my entire career looking into the eyes of people who are absolutely convinced they're doing the right thing, even as their lives are crumbling into dust right in front of them. It's a peculiar kind of blindness. It's the kind of blindness that doesn't come from a lack of sight, but from a surplus of ego and a shortage of self-awareness. I've seen it in addicts, I've seen it in scammers, but where I see it most and where it breaks my heart the most is in parents. They come onto my stage, chest puffed out, holding a list of their child's transgressions like it's a legal indictment, completely oblivious to the fact that they've written themselves into the role of the villain in their own child's story. That's exactly where Marcus was when he first walked into my studio. He didn't come here for help, he came for an endorsement. He wanted me to tell him he was the hero, the last line of defense against a rebellious teenager. He wanted me to look at his 17-year-old daughter, Elena, and tell her she was the problem. But as I watched them through the monitors in the back, long before the cameras started rolling, I saw a very different story unfolding. Marcus sat in his dressing room with his arms crossed so tightly over his chest it looked like he was trying to hold himself together. He was a big man, a former military officer, a man who believed in order, discipline, and the chain of command. To him, parenting wasn't a relationship, it was a mission. And according to his report, the mission was failing. He had this look on his face, this stern, uncompromising mask that I've seen 1,000 times. It's the look of a man who thinks he's protecting his family when, in reality, he's suffocating them. Next to him was his wife, Sarah, who looked like she'd been crying for 3 years straight. She had that peace at any price. Look, the kind of woman who has spent her entire marriage trying to be the buffer between a lightning bolt and a lightning rod. And then there was Elena. She was 17, sitting as far away from her father as the small sofa would allow, her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders hunched. She didn't look like a rebel to me. She looked like a girl who had gone internal because the external world was just too loud and too hostile to survive. The central problem, as Marcus saw it, was that Elena was out of control. He told my producers that she was sneaking out, failing her classes, and hanging out with a dangerous crowd. He called her unreliable, manipulative, and deceitful. He used those words with a clinical coldness that chilled me. He had labels for her, but he didn't have a heart for her. He had turned his daughter into a project that needed to be managed, a problem that needed to be solved. He thought he was being a good father because he provided a roof, food, and structure. But structure without connection is just a prison. I've said it before and I'll say it again. You cannot influence someone who doesn't feel valued by you. Marcus didn't value Elena. He valued her compliance. And since she wasn't complying, he was ramping up the pressure, convinced that if he just squeezed a little harder, he'd get the result he wanted. He was wrong. As I sat there in my office, watching the pre-interview footage, I started to look for the why. I don't care about the what. I know what happened. The shouting matches, the grounded for life sentences, the tracking apps on the phone. I wanted to know the why. Why was a man so invested in his own righteousness that he was willing to watch his daughter wither away? To understand that, I had to look back. I had to look at where Marcus came from. In our private sessions before the show, Marcus spoke about his own father. It was the classic tough love story, but on steroids. His father had been a man of the suck-it-up generation. No praise, only correction. No affection, only instruction. Marcus grew up believing that a father's job was to forge his children into steel, to harden them against a world that didn't care about their feelings. He thought he was doing Elena a favor by being her harshest critic. He thought he was preparing her. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't preparing her for the world, he was preparing her to leave him. He was creating a home environment so toxic, so devoid of grace, that the dangerous crowd he was so afraid of looked like a sanctuary to her. We call this a closed system. Marcus had created a system where there was no room for error, no room for growth, and certainly no room for his daughter's voice. Every time Elena tried to express a feeling, Marcus countered with a rule. Every time she showed weakness, he met her with a lecture. He was a right fighter. He would rather be right than be in a relationship. And let me tell you, you can be right all the way to an empty house and a daughter who doesn't take your calls. I started to see the patterns. Marcus used what I call the 3 C's of toxic parenting: control, criticism, and comparison. He controlled every minute of her day. He criticized every choice she made, from the clothes she wore to the friends she picked. And he compared her constantly to his own idealized version of what a good girl should be. This wasn't parenting, it was an interrogation that never ended. Elena's rebellion, the sneaking out, the failing grades, wasn't a sign of a bad kid. It was a cry for help. It was the only way she knew how to say, "I'm drowning in here." When you push a child that hard, they only have 2 choices. They either break and become a shadow, or they explode and run. Elena was in the process of exploding. The escalation in their house had reached a breaking point. Marcus had recently installed cameras in the common areas of the house. He had a logbook where he made Elena record her activities every hour. He had taken the door off her hinges because she didn't earn the right to privacy. Think about that. A 17-year-old girl with no door, no phone, no privacy, and a father who watched her every move through a lens. That's not a home. It's a panopticon. The tension was so thick you could feel it through the screen. Sarah, the mother, was caught in the middle, trying to play the peacemaker, but by doing so, she was actually enabling Marcus's tyranny. She would whisper to Elena to just follow the rules so he doesn't get mad, which only taught Elena that her mother was a silent witness to her misery, not an advocate. By the time they reached my stage, Marcus was ready for a fight. He walked out there with his chin up, looking at the audience as if he were waiting for a standing ovation for his strict standards. He had his evidence tucked in a folder under his arm. He was ready to prove to me and to the world that he was the victim of a wayward daughter. He had no idea that I was about to peel back the layers of his righteousness and show him the wreckage he was leaving in his wake. He thought he was here to talk about Elena's behavior. I was there to talk about his character. Because at the end of the day, children don't do what you say, they do what you do. And what Marcus was doing was teaching his daughter that love is conditional, that power is everything, and that her feelings didn't matter. I had to get him to see that before it was too late. I had to get him to look in the mirror, but I knew he was going to hate what he saw. The atmosphere in the studio was heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. Marcus sat there, stiff as a board, his folder of evidence gripped tightly in his hands. He had come prepared to prosecute his daughter, and he was waiting for me to take my seat on the bench as the judge. But that's not my job. I'm not there to judge. I'm there to observe, to analyze, and to provide a wake-up call to people who are sleepwalking through their own lives. I looked at him, then at Elena, then at Sarah. The geometry of their relationship was all wrong. They weren't a family. They were 3 individuals trapped in a cycle of hurt and defense, bouncing off one another like pinballs in a machine that was rigged to lose. Marcus started talking almost immediately, his voice booming, filled with the practiced resonance of someone used to being heard and obeyed. He began listing the dates, the times, and the specific infractions Elena had committed over the last 6 months. It was a cold, calculated recitation of failures. I let him go on for a few minutes because I wanted to see the effect it had on the room. I wanted to see how Elena reacted to being treated like a criminal defendant. She didn't argue. She didn't roll her eyes. She just sat there, becoming smaller and smaller with every word he spoke. She was checking out, a psychological defense mechanism where a person mentally leaves the room because the emotional environment is too hostile to endure. And then there was Sarah, looking at Marcus with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, then looking at Elena with a look of helpless apology. It was a textbook case of a dysfunctional family dynamic where the father is the dictator, the mother is the collaborator, and the child is the victim of a regime she never asked to join. Marcus, I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. I've heard the list, I've seen the logbook, I've seen the camera footage of your hallway. And let me ask you something. If I ran my office the way you run your home, how many people do you think would want to work for me? He blinked, taken aback. He wasn't expecting me to challenge his methods. He was expecting me to validate them. He started to explain that the world is a tough place and that he was just preparing her for reality. That's the most common excuse I hear from overbearing parents. They wrap their need for control in the flag of preparation. They tell themselves they're being tough so the world won't be tougher. But there's a massive difference between being a mentor and being a jailer. A mentor prepares you to fly. A jailer just makes sure you can't leave the cell. I decided to dig into the incident that finally brought them to me. A few weeks prior, Elena had been caught sneaking out of her bedroom window at 2 a.m. Marcus hadn't just grounded her. He had called the police and reported her as a runaway, even though she was standing right in front of him. He wanted her to be handcuffed. He wanted her to spend a night in juvenile hall because he thought the system would do what he couldn't break her spirit. When the police arrived that night, Marcus wasn't looking for help. He was looking for a weapon. He wanted to use the authority of the state to crush the last bit of resistance in his daughter. I looked at him on that stage and I asked him, "What did you think was going to happen, Marcus? Did you think she'd get into the back of that squad car, look at the handcuffs, and suddenly realize what a great guy you are? Did you think that was the moment she'd say, 'Gee, Dad, thanks for the life lesson'?" He didn't have an answer for that. He just kept saying it was about consequences. But let's be real here. That wasn't a consequence. That was an ambush. I turned to Sarah then. I wanted to know where the mother was in all of this. Sarah was a soft-spoken woman, the kind who spends her life trying to keep the peace by being invisible. She told me she stood in the hallway and watched the officers talk to her daughter. She said she felt torn. I stopped her right there. "Torn?" I said. "If someone is attacking your cub, you don't feel torn, you become a shield. When you stood by and let him weaponize the police against your own child, you didn't just stay neutral. You chose a side. You chose his ego over her safety." The look on Elena's face when her mother said that it was a mixture of "I knew it and it still hurts." That's a heavy burden for a 17-year-old to carry, the realization that neither of the people who brought you into this world actually has your back. The escalation didn't stop at the police call. In the days following, Marcus had doubled down. He'd restricted her food to basic nutrition, meaning no snacks, no treats, just the bare minimum because she hadn't earned the luxury of flavor. He had her scrubbing floors with a toothbrush. He was trying to break her like a horse. But the thing about human beings is that when you try to break them, they don't just become submissive. They become resentful, they become vengeful, or, in Elena's case, they just stop caring. And that is the most dangerous place for a teenager to be. When a kid stops caring about the consequences, you have lost all your leverage. You've fired all your big guns and she's still standing there, and now you have nothing left but your own anger. Marcus was vibrating with that anger on my stage. He was so focused on being right that he couldn't see how wrong he was for the situation. I see this all the time with people who have a high need for control. They think that if they just find the right combination of punishments, they can force someone to be who they want them to be. But you can't legislate the human heart. You can't demand respect. You have to earn it. And Marcus had spent years bankrupting his emotional bank account with his daughter. He was overdrawn, and he was still trying to write checks. I decided it was time to shift gears. I told the crew to play a clip of a private interview we did with Elena. In the video, she wasn't the rebellious teen Marcus described. She was just a kid. She was crying, but it wasn't a loud, dramatic cry. It was that quiet, hopeless sobbing that comes when you've completely given up. She said, "I don't think my dad even knows what color my eyes are. He only knows if I'm standing up straight. I feel like I'm a ghost in my own house." When the clip ended, the studio was dead silent. I looked at Marcus. For the first time, his mask slipped just a fraction. He looked uncomfortable. Not remorseful, mind you, but uncomfortable. "You call her a liar, Marcus," I said, leaning in. "You call her deceitful, but you've created a world where the truth is a liability. If she tells you the truth that she's unhappy, that she hates the rules, that she's struggling, what do? You punish her, you lecture her, you tell her she's wrong to feel that way. So what choice does she have? She has to lie to survive you. You've trained her to be a world-class deceiver, and then you have the nerve to be offended by it." This is the part of the process where the right fighter usually gets defensive. Marcus started talking about standards and values. He talked about how he wanted her to have a good life. I've heard this a million times. It's the "I'm doing this for your own good" defense. It's the ultimate gaslighting move. You're hurting someone and telling them it's a gift. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Marcus, you aren't doing this for her. You're doing this for you. You're doing this because you're terrified that if you aren't in control, you're failing. You're using her as a metric for your own success as a man. If she's perfect, you're a success. If she's messy, which, by the way, every teenager is, then you think you're a failure. And you can't handle being a failure, so you're trying to bully her into being your trophy." The tension was reaching a boiling point. Elena finally spoke up, her voice trembling. She looked at her father and said, "I don't even hate you, Dad. I just don't know who you are. And I don't think you want to know who I am." Marcus didn't even look at her. He looked at me and said, "See, she's being dramatic. She's trying to play the victim." It was a classic move, dismissing the emotion to avoid the responsibility. He was so armored up that even his daughter's pain couldn't penetrate the shell. I knew I had to go deeper. I had to get past the what and the how and get to the core of why this man was so committed to this destructive path. We went back to his childhood, to those memories of his own father. Marcus described a man who was a provider but never a parent, a man who thought a hug was a sign of weakness. Marcus was literally repeating the script of his own trauma and calling it parenting. He thought he was being a better father than his own because he was involved, but he didn't realize that being involved without being connected is just another form of abandonment. It's emotional abandonment. You're there physically, you're there financially, but you're absent spiritually. "You're playing a role, Marcus," I said. "You're playing the role of the strict father because that's the only script you were ever given. But look at the audience. Look at your wife. Look at your daughter. Does it look like your play is a hit? Does it look like anyone is enjoying the performance? You're the only one left in the theater, and the building is on fire." He sat there, his face turning a deep shade of red. He was angry. But underneath the anger, I could see the first flickers of doubt. And that doubt is where the work begins. If I can get a man like Marcus to doubt his own righteousness, even for a second, then there's a chance for a breakthrough. But we weren't there yet. He was still clinging to his folder. He still wanted to prove she was bad. He brought up a text message she'd sent to a friend, complaining about him. He read it aloud like it was a confession of a crime. He was looking for me to join him in his outrage. Instead, I just looked at him with pity. "Marcus," I said, If someone treated me the way you treat her, I'd say a lot worse than that. The fact that this is the best evidence you have just shows how desperate you are to be the victim here. I turned to Sarah and asked her, how long are you going to sit in that chair and watch him destroy your daughter because every day you don't stop him? You're telling Elena that she's not worth fighting for. You're telling her that your husband's ego is more important than her soul. Sarah started to cry, really cry this time. The peace at any price strategy was finally failing her, and she was realizing that the price was her daughter's future. The room was heavy with the weight of years of unspoken pain. We were right on the edge of something. I could feel it, the audience could feel it, and Marcus, for all his bluster, could feel it too. He was losing the room, he was losing his wife, and he was losing his grip on the narrative. It was time for the question that would change everything. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, getting into Marcus's personal space. I wanted him to feel the weight of my attention. I wanted him to realize that I wasn't going to let him retreat into his list of grievances or his military-grade logic. The folder in his lap was shaking just a little bit. He was losing his grip on the narrative, and for a man like Marcus, losing control of the narrative is the same as losing his identity. He looked at me, his eyes hard, still searching for an ally in his crusade for discipline. I decided it was time to stop talking about what Elena was doing and start talking about what Marcus was feeling. Because behind every bully, and let's be clear, Marcus was bullying his family. There is a profound, unacknowledged fear. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming quieter but more intense. You've spent the last 45 minutes telling me what a failure your daughter is. You've documented her mistakes like you're building a case for a grand jury. You've told me about the sneaking out, the grades, the attitude. You've painted a picture of a girl who is a heartbeat away from disaster. And you say you do all of this, the cameras, the logbooks, the police calls, because you want to save her. You say you want her to have a good life. But I want to ask you one question, and I want you to think long and hard before you answer it. Because the answer to this question is going to tell me everything I need to know about whether there's any hope for this family. He squared his shoulders, trying to look ready for whatever I was going to throw at him. He probably expected a question about his rules or his childhood. He was ready for a debate. He wasn't ready for a mirror. I looked him straight in the eyes and asked, Marcus, if you were Elena and you had to come home every single day to a man who looked at you with nothing but disappointment, who tracked your every move like a criminal, and who made it clear that his love was a prize you could only win by being perfect, would you want to be a good girl for that man? Or would you want to burn his house down just to see the look on his face? The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the studio lights. Marcus didn't move. He didn't blink. The question hung in the air like a physical object. I wasn't asking him about parenting techniques anymore. I was asking him to put himself in the shoes of the person he claimed to love most in the world. I was forcing him to see himself through her eyes. And for a man who had built his entire ego on being the righteous protector, seeing himself as the oppressor was a psychic blow he wasn't prepared for. He started to open his mouth to give a scripted answer about respect and boundaries, but I held up a hand. Don't, I said, don't give me the lecture. Don't tell me about the rules. Answer the question as a human being. If the person who was supposed to be your sanctuary was actually your drill sergeant, would you feel safe? Would you feel loved? Or would you feel like you were trapped in a cage with a tiger that was always hungry for a mistake? I saw it then. It was a fleeting thing, but it was there, a flash of recognition in his eyes. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. He saw the way she was hunched over, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to protect her internal organs from a physical blow. He saw the way she didn't even look up to see his reaction because she had already learned that his reactions didn't include her feelings. He saw the ghost she had described in the pre-interview. I never thought of it like that, he whispered. His voice was different. The booming authority was gone, replaced by something thin and fragile. I thought I was being the wall between her and the world. I thought if I was tough enough, she wouldn't have to be. But Marcus, I said, you aren't the wall between her and the world. You've become the world she needs protection from. You've made your home a battlefield, and then you wonder why she's acting like a soldier in enemy territory. She's not rebelling against you, she's surviving you. Sarah, who had been sobbing quietly, let out a ragged breath. That's what I've been trying to say. She choked out. Every time I try to tell him he's going too far, he tells me I'm being weak. He tells me I'm going to be the reason she ends up on the street. I've been so scared of him being right that I didn't see how wrong he was. I turned back to Marcus. You're so afraid of her failing that you've guaranteed her failure. Because even if she gets straight A's, even if she never breaks another rule, she's already failed at the one thing that matters, having a relationship with her father. You're winning the war, Marcus, but you're losing your daughter. Is that the trade you want to make? Do you want to be right all the way to her wedding day, which you won't be invited to? Do you want to be right when she has kids of her own and she tells them their grandfather is a man they should never, ever be alone with? That hit him like a freight train. I could see the color drain from his face. The right fighter was starting to realize that the prize for winning his fight was total isolation. This is the moment I look for in every intervention, the moment where the person realizes that their survival strategy is actually the thing that is killing them. Marcus had spent his whole life trying to be the man his father wasn't, but in doing so, he had become the man his father was. Just with a different set of tools. He was using cameras instead of belts, but the trauma was the same. Elena finally looked up. Her eyes were red, but there was a spark of something new in them. It wasn't anger, it was hope, but the kind of hope that's terrifying because it's so close to disappointment. She looked at her father and said, I just wanted you to like me, Dad. Not proud of me because I did what you said. I just wanted you to like who I am. Marcus dropped the folder. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and papers scattered across the stage, his evidence, his proof, his armor. He looked at the mess on the floor and then looked at his daughter. He didn't have a lecture. He didn't have a rule. He just had a realization. I don't even know who you are, he said, and for the first time, it wasn't an accusation. It was an admission of grief. I sat back and let that sink in. This was the breakthrough moment. But it wasn't the end. It was just the demolition of the old, rotten structure. Now, we had to see if there was enough of a foundation left to build something new. I told him we were going to take a break, but I told Marcus to stay right there. I wanted him to sit in that discomfort. I wanted him to feel the weight of that empty folder. Backstage, I spoke to my producers. He's cracked, I said. The ego is down. Now we need to see if the heart is still beating, because that's the thing about people like Marcus. Once the armor is gone, they are incredibly vulnerable. They don't know how to exist without the rules. They have to learn how to be a person again, not just a set of standards. And that's a long, painful process. When we came back, the energy in the studio had shifted. The audience wasn't judging Marcus anymore. They were leaning in, rooting for him to find his way back to his family. I looked at the three of them and I said, we've spent a lot of time talking about what's wrong. Now I want to talk about what's possible. But it requires a total surrender. Marcus, you have to resign as the warden of this family. Sarah, you have to resign as the silent witness. And Elena, you have to be willing to give them a chance to earn your trust back, even though they haven't earned it yet. I told them about the plan I had put together. It wasn't just go home and be nice. It was intensive therapy. Individual and family. It was reparenting for Marcus so he could learn how to be a father without being a dictator. It was empowerment for Sarah so she could find her voice. And it was a safe space for Elena to express her anger without fear of retribution. This isn't going to be easy, I warned them. Marcus, you're going to want to grab that folder back. You're going to want to check those cameras. You're going to feel like the world is spinning out of control if you aren't the one spinning it. But every time you feel that urge, I want you to ask yourself, do I want to be in control or do I want to be in her life? The segment ended with Marcus doing something he hadn't done in years. He reached out his hand toward Elena. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her. He just put his hand out, palm up, in a gesture of peace. It was a small thing, but on that stage, it felt like a mountain moving. Elena looked at his hand for a long time. She didn't take it, not yet, but she didn't move away either. And for today, that was enough. When the studio lights finally dimmed and the audience filtered out, a different kind of silence settled over the stage. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of a confrontation, but the exhausted, hollow silence that follows a disaster. Marcus, Sarah, and Elena stayed in their seats for a long time. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck who had just washed up on a strange shore, unsure if they were safe or just lost in a new way. I walked over to them, not as the guy with the microphone, but as a man who has seen how easily families can slip through the cracks of their own making. I told them that the hardest part wasn't what just happened on that stage. The hardest part was going to be the car ride home, the first dinner in that house without the cameras, and the first time Elena did something that triggered Marcus's old instincts. Change is not an event, it's a process. You don't just wake up one morning and decide to stop being a right fighter. It's a habit that's baked into your bones. For Marcus, the need for control was his oxygen. I knew that the moment he stepped back into his kingdom, every fiber of his being was going to scream at him to reassert his authority. He was going to feel naked without his logbooks and his evidence. I told him right then and there, the next time you feel that itch to grab the reins, I want you to remember the look on your daughter's face when I asked you that question. That look is the cost of your control. Is it worth it? He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked smaller now, less like a commander and more like a man who had realized he'd been guarding an empty fortress. We set them up with our aftercare program, which is the most critical part of what we do. People think the show is the cure, but the show is just the diagnosis. The real surgery happens in the months of therapy that follow. I checked in with their therapist, Dr. Miller, a few weeks after they returned home. The report wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. In fact, it was messy. Marcus had actually gone home and uninstalled the cameras, a huge first step, but the psychological cameras were still rolling. He was still monitoring Elena with his eyes, still hovering, still waiting for the inevitable mistake so he could say, "See, I was right all along." There was an incident about 3 weeks in. Elena stayed out 20 minutes past her new negotiated curfew. It wasn't a sneaking out situation. She was just late. In the old days, Marcus would have called the police or taken her door off again. He told the therapist that he felt his chest tighten, his face get hot, and that old familiar justice rising up in his throat. He wanted to crush her for those 20 minutes. He wanted to prove that she was unreliable and that he was justified in his tyranny. But Sarah did something she had never done before. She stood in the hallway between Marcus and the front door, and she said, "No, we are not doing this. It's 20 minutes, Marcus. It's a mistake, not a crime. Go into the kitchen and sit down." That was a turning point. Sarah had finally found her backbone, and by doing so, she gave Marcus a chance to be a better man. She stopped being the buffer and started being the boundary. When Elena walked in, braced for a war, she found her father sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood, struggling to breathe through his anger. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for a logbook. He just said, "You're late. It worried your mother." We'll talk about it tomorrow when I'm not so angry. Elena told the therapist she went to her room and cried for 2 hours. Not because she was in trouble, but because for the first time in her life, she felt like her father was trying to choose her over his own ego. This is the psychological heavy lifting that most people aren't willing to do. It's easy to be a dictator. It's hard to be a partner. It's easy to have rules. It's hard to have a relationship. Marcus had to learn how to live with the messiness of a teenager. He had to learn that a house with a little bit of chaos and a lot of love is infinitely better than a house with perfect order and no soul. He had to realize that his daughter wasn't a project to be finished or a soldier to be trained. She was a human being in the process of becoming, and his job wasn't to dictate the destination, but to provide the fuel and the safety for the journey. I spent a lot of time thinking about Marcus's right fighter syndrome. It's a plague in our society. We've become so obsessed with winning the argument that we don't care if we lose the person. I see it in politics, I see it in marriages, and I see it most tragically in parenting. Parents like Marcus think that standards are a substitute for connection. They think that if they just set the bar high enough, their kids will eventually thank them for the view. But if you don't help them climb, and if you scream at them every time they slip, they're never going to reach the top. They're just going to find a different mountain where they don't have to hear your voice. Elena started to change too, but her change was slower, more cautious. Trust that has been shattered into 1,000 pieces doesn't get glued back together overnight. She was testing them. That's what kids do when the rules change. They test the new boundaries to see if they're real or just another trap. She'd push a little here, push a little there, waiting for the old Marcus to come roaring back, and there were moments when he almost did. But they were in a closed loop with their therapist. Every time they hit a snag, they had a place to take it. They were learning a new language, the language of I feel instead of you did. I remember a follow-up call I had with Marcus about 2 months after the show. He sounded tired, but it was a good kind of tired. He said, "Doctor, Phil, it's a lot harder to be a nice guy than it was to be a tough guy. When I was the tough guy, I always knew what to do. I just followed the rules. Now, I have to actually listen, and sometimes what I hear hurts." I told him, "Marcus, that pain you're feeling, that's called growth. That's the sound of your heart waking up after a long sleep. Don't run from it. Lean into it." He told me about a moment they had on a Sunday afternoon. Usually, Sundays were inspection days where he would go through Elena's room and her schoolwork with a fine-tooth comb. Instead, he asked her if she wanted to go get a burger. Just the two of them. No agenda, no lecture. He said they sat in a booth for an hour, and for 45 minutes, it was awkward as hell. But then, Elena started talking about a book she was reading. She talked about the characters and why she liked them and how she felt like she could relate to the girl in the story who was trying to find her way home. Marcus said he just sat there and listened. He didn't correct her grammar. He didn't tell her the book was a waste of time. He just listened. And he realized he'd missed 17 years of moments like that because he'd been too busy being the warden. As I look back on that burger shop story Marcus told me, I realize that's where the real healing began. It wasn't in the grand gestures or the dramatic apologies on a television stage. It was in the quiet, uncomfortable, 45 minutes of silence where a father finally decided to stop being a prosecutor and started being a witness to his daughter's life. That is the fundamental shift every right fighter has to make. You have to move from a posture of judgment to a posture of curiosity. You have to stop asking, how can I fix this person? And start asking, who is this person really? The road wasn't a straight line for them. Marcus had a major relapse about 6 months in. He found a pack of cigarettes in Elena's jacket, something that would have triggered a total lockdown in the past. He felt that old heat rising. that urge to grab the evidence and start a cross-examination. But instead of storming into her room, he went for a walk. He walked for 3 miles until his heart rate slowed down and he could hear something other than his own anger. When he came back, he sat Elena down and said, "I found these. I'm disappointed because I worry about your health, but I'm not going to take your door off. I just want to know if you're okay and if there's something you're trying to cope with that we aren't talking about." Elena told us later that was the moment she knew the old dad was truly gone. She didn't feel the need to lie anymore because the truth was no longer a weapon used against her. Sarah's transformation was just as vital. She stopped being the silent witness. She realized that by staying quiet to keep the peace, she had been an accomplice to the war. She started speaking up in the moment, not 3 days later. She and Marcus had to dismantle their entire marriage and rebuild it on a foundation of partnership rather than one-man rule. They had to learn how to disagree without it becoming a power struggle. I always say that in a relationship, you're either a team or you're opponents. There is no middle ground. They finally chose to be a team. A year after they sat on my stage, I received a photo in the mail. It was a picture from Elena's high school graduation. In the photo, Marcus isn't standing like a drill sergeant. He has his arm draped loosely around Elena's shoulders, and he's looking at her with a look of pure, unadulterated pride, not because she followed the rules, but because of the young woman she had become. Elena's smile wasn't the guarded, tight-lipped expression I'd seen in the studio. It was bright and genuine. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a person who was seen, heard, and valued. The title of this story mentions a question that exposed everything. People often ask me why that specific question, asking Marcus if he would want to burn his own house down if he were in Elena's shoes, was the turning point. It's because it bypassed his logic and hid his empathy. Marcus had spent his life building a house of rules, thinking he was creating a home. That question made him realize he'd actually built a cage, and the only natural response to a cage is the desire to destroy it. It forced him to acknowledge the humanity of his daughter as being equal to his own. The lesson here for anyone listening is simple, but it's the hardest thing you'll ever do. You have to decide what's more important, your ego or your family. You can be the rightest person in the world, you can have the most disciplined kids and the cleanest house and the most orderly life, but if the people in that house are afraid of you, you have failed. Influence is born out of relationship, not out of fear. Fear produces compliance, but love produces commitment. Marcus learned that his parenting style wasn't a style at all. It was a defense mechanism. He was protecting himself from the fear of failure by over-controlling the variables. But you can't control another human being without breaking them. He chose to stop breaking his daughter and started building a bridge instead. It's a bridge they're still walking across every single day. It's not perfect, it's still messy, and they still have bad days. But now, when they have a bad day, they have each other. And at the end of the day, that's the only right that actually matters.